would you do if, at your son's funeral, a loyal dog refused to let the coffin be lowered into the ground? At a quiet cemetery, snow fell like white ashes as mourners stood in silence. Margaret Hayes, a 65-year-old widow, clutched her son's photo, her tears soaking the edges of the frame. In the casket lay Officer Daniel Hayes, or so everyone believed. Beside her, Max, Daniel's canine partner, trembled and whined. Then, as the priest whispered the last prayer, Max lunged forward, scratching at the earth, barking with such ferocity that the coffin shook. Gasps echoed across the graveyard. Margaret's heart nearly broke anew. Why would the dog go mad now, at this moment?
What is happening?
The police chief urged calm, but the pressure was too strong.
Be ready for...
Slowly, the lid creaked open, and what lay inside sent a scream tearing through the cold air. Do you believe animals can sense truths hidden from us? Comment below. The late autumn sky hung low over the quiet suburbs. A veil of pale gray clouds stretched across the horizon, and the wind whispered through the bare branches of the oak trees that lined the modest street. In a small, weathered house with faded shutters sat Margaret Hayes, a woman of 65, whose body bore the softness of age, yet whose eyes carried the weight of sorrow and endurance. Her hair, once a rich chestnut, was now streaked with silver and pulled back loosely, revealing a face lined with years of labor and loss. She had lost her husband nearly 2 decades earlier, and since then she had built her world around one figure alone, her son, Daniel Hayes. Daniel, at 34, was the kind of man who drew respect before a word was spoken. Broad-shouldered and tall, with a square jaw and neatly trimmed dark beard, he looked every inch the officer he was. Yet those who knew him best saw more than his uniform. They saw a man tempered by discipline, but softened by compassion. His hazel eyes carried a quiet determination, the mark of someone who had seen violence and chaos, yet still clung to the belief that he could make a difference. As a child, he had grown up watching his father, a steelworker with rough hands and a gentle heart, sacrifice everything for family. When that father died suddenly, Daniel stepped into the role of protector, not only for his mother, but for himself. That responsibility became the foundation of his character, molding him into the steadfast police officer he now was. Margaret's evenings were built around his return. Each day, just before dusk, she would sit by the window with a shawl draped across her shoulders, waiting for the familiar rhythm of his boots on the walkway. And always, alongside him, padded the heavy steps of Max, Daniel's canine partner. Max was a German shepherd, now 5 years old, his thick sable coat shining even under dim street lamps. His eyes, however, carried a story of their own, deep amber orbs that reflected loyalty and grief. He had once served with another handler who was killed in a shootout, and since then, Max had become distrustful, unwilling to bond. But with Daniel, something shifted. Though wary at first, Max slowly allowed trust to creep back into his life. Margaret noticed the way the dog sometimes pressed his head gently against Daniel's knee at dinner, or how he paced at the door the moment her son's patrol car pulled into the drive. She had begun to think of Max not as a guest, but as another son, a quiet guardian who shared her love and her fears. And yet, as she watched them from the window that evening, a sudden unease crept into her chest. The image of her son laughing softly, Max trotting at his side, should have filled her with peace. But instead, for reasons she could not name, Margaret felt the chill of foreboding sweep across her heart, as though something precious was already slipping away. The early weeks of Max's arrival at Daniel's side were far from easy. The German shepherd, though powerful and striking with his sable coat and muscular build, carried an invisible wound in his heart. His previous handler had died in a sudden shootout, and since that day, Max had become a creature of suspicion. His amber eyes, once full of trust, now glimmered with wariness. When Daniel first reached out to pat him, Max would recoil, lips curling back with a warning growl, as if to say, "Do not come too close. I cannot lose again." Daniel, though stern in uniform, was patient at heart. He remembered how grief had shaped him when his father died, leaving him the sole protector for his mother. That same pain helped him understand Max's silence. Instead of forcing closeness, Daniel simply sat near the dog, talking to him in low tones as though speaking to an equal, not a subordinate. "You don't owe me anything," he would murmur after long shifts, "but if you give me your trust, I promise never to betray it." Weeks passed in this quiet rhythm until one freezing night in January, an urgent call came. A child had wandered off into the woods during a snowstorm. Daniel was dispatched with Max. The forest loomed like a black wall, branches heavy with snow, the wind cutting into their faces. Daniel pushed forward without hesitation, flashlight trembling in his gloved hand, calling out both the child's name and Max's. "Come on, boy, help me bring him home," he urged, his voice carrying equal parts command and plea. Max's ears twitched. The scent of fear and innocence lingered in the air, and his instincts ignited. For the first time since his loss, he surged ahead, nose pressed to the ground, weaving through the darkness. Minutes later, a faint cry broke the silence. Under a fallen pine, a shivering boy no older than 7 was curled up, cheeks pale, lips trembling. Daniel threw off his coat, wrapping it around the child. Max circled close, pressing his warm body against the boy, as though to lend his own strength. When they returned, safe and victorious, Daniel sat heavily on the ground beside the patrol car. To his surprise, Max lay down at his feet, resting his head gently across Daniel's boots. The man smiled through his exhaustion, his heart swelling with quiet joy. He knew then that the wall between them had finally crumbled. Something had shifted forever. Trust had been born. The modest Hayes home carried an air of quiet resilience. Its wooden floors creaked under every step, and the wallpaper, faded with time, bore witness to decades of love and loss. Yet in that space, Margaret found comfort. For the first time in many years, she no longer felt entirely alone. She had Daniel, tall and steadfast, and Max, the loyal guardian with eyes that seemed to hold human depth. Together, they made a family, unconventional, yet whole. Every evening after patrol, Daniel returned with a tired smile, shoulders heavy from the burdens of his work. Margaret would watch him peel off his uniform jacket, revealing the man beneath the badge, the son who still tried to hide his weariness. Max padded faithfully at his heels, tail wagging, waiting for Margaret's approving nod before curling into his spot near the hearth. At dinner, laughter often filled the room, a surprising melody in a house long accustomed to silence. Margaret would watch as Max placed his head gently on Daniel's knee, begging for scraps, while Daniel teased, "You eat more than I do, partner." It was in these simple rituals that the weight of the outside world melted away. Mornings carried their own rhythm. Daniel, disciplined even at home, would lace up his boots in the soft glow of dawn. Margaret often handed him a packed meal, her wrinkled hands brushing his as if reluctant to let go. Max would stand at the door, tail wagging furiously, eyes gleaming with a mix of loyalty and worry, as if reminding Daniel to come back safely. When the patrol car finally pulled away, Margaret would stand at the window, her heart swelling with both pride and quiet fear, watching her two warriors set off into a world that often gave more wounds than blessings. Inside her heart, Margaret nurtured a fragile gratitude. After years of loneliness, she had been given this strange but precious gift: a son and a dog who seemed to share the same soul. Daniel's strength was a shield. Max's devotion was a balm. Together, they kept her anchored, reminding her that family did not always need to be defined by blood alone. Yet at night, when the house fell silent, Margaret sometimes clasped her rosary and whispered prayers, asking God to keep both her warriors safe. She knew too well that happiness could be fleeting, and she feared the day when fate might test her again. The night that changed everything began with an urgent call. The city streets lay cloaked in darkness, rain-slicked pavement reflecting the red and blue glow of police sirens. Daniel, already weary from a long shift, sat in the patrol car with Max at his side. His radio crackled. Armed robbers had been cornered in a warehouse on the east side. It was supposed to be a swift operation, but in his gut, Daniel felt a coil of unease. He glanced at Max, whose ears were alert, body tense, as if sensing the storm that was about to break. When the team approached the warehouse, silence hung heavy for a single heartbeat. Then chaos erupted. Gunfire shattered the night, echoing like thunder within steel walls. Muzzle flashes split the dark as officers shouted orders, their boots pounding across the concrete floor. Daniel charged forward, his instincts overriding fear. He saw a younger officer freeze under fire, and without hesitation, Daniel hurled himself into the open, shielding the man with his own body. Bullets ripped the air around them. Max lunged like a shadow given form, fangs bared, muscles straining. He tore into the arm of one assailant, forcing the weapon to clatter to the ground. Even when a bullet grazed his flank, Max refused to release his grip, his growls vibrating with fury. Together, man and dog fought as though they were one heartbeat. But the numbers were against them. Too many assailants, too many weapons. Smoke and screams filled the air. Daniel felt the burn of searing pain as a round struck his side, his strength faltering. He gritted his teeth, his vision blurring, refusing to collapse while his men still needed him. For a fleeting moment, he thought of Margaret, her fragile hands, her hopeful prayers, and of the warmth of their small home. The thought cut deeper than any bullet. Would she now lose everything? When the last shots died down, the warehouse was littered with wounded officers. Sirens wailed again as ambulances rushed to the scene. Daniel lay pale, blood soaking through his uniform, his breath ragged. Max stood guard, wounded but defiant, his amber eyes fixed on his fallen partner. By the time word reached the Hayes home, the night had already become a nightmare. Margaret clutched the phone, her body trembling as the words pierced her heart. Your son did not make it. Her knees buckled, and the world seemed to collapse around her. The morning of the funeral arrived wrapped in a veil of mist. The cemetery lay quiet beneath a pale sky, rows of gravestones jutting like silent witnesses to grief. Margaret Hayes walked slowly along the gravel path. Her body stooped not just with age, but with the crushing weight of sorrow. She wore a black dress, its fabric faded from years of use, and in her trembling hands she clutched a framed photograph of Daniel. The glass was smudged with her tears, and her voice broke as she whispered to the image, "Daniel, you were everything to me. Who do I have now?" The service began with hushed prayers, the voices of the priests and officers blending into the stillness. Colleagues in uniform stood stiffly, medals gleaming dully against their dark jackets, their expressions carved with loss. Some avoided looking at Margaret, for her grief was almost unbearable to witness. To them, Daniel had been a comrade. To her, he was blood, flesh, the last fragment of family she had left. At the foot of the coffin lay Max. The German shepherd's once proud frame seemed diminished, his ears pressed back, his head resting heavily on the cold wood. From time to time, he let out low, mournful whines that carried through the crowd like a broken hymn. Many who gathered wiped their eyes at the sight, for the dog's despair mirrored that of the mother beside him. As the final words were spoken and the pallbearers prepared to lower the coffin into the earth, the stillness shattered. Max suddenly sprang to his feet, muscles taut, eyes burning with wild urgency. With a guttural bark, he lunged at the coffin, paws scraping against it, claws clattering as he tried to hold it back. The sharp echoes of his barks pierced the cemetery, startling mourners and scattering birds from nearby trees. The officers rushed forward, arms outstretched, but Max twisted and pulled, refusing to be restrained. His growls deepened, his body trembling as though every fiber of him screamed against what was happening. Margaret, startled, staggered backward, clutching her chest. Her tears came in fresh waves, her mind caught between anguish and confusion. Why now, at this sacred moment, would Max resist with such ferocity? What could the animal know that no one else could? The cemetery fell silent, broken only by the frantic barking of Max. The priests, pallbearers, and officers exchanged uneasy glances, their composure cracking under the relentless noise. Finally, against the stern protests of the police chief, the order was given to open the coffin. The crowd leaned forward, hearts pounding, as the lid creaked upward. What they saw turned sorrow into horror. Margaret staggered back, her voice splitting the heavy air. "No, this is not my son." Her trembling hands clutched her chest as her eyes refused to accept the stranger lying within. The face, pale and lifeless, bore scars of battle. But it was not Daniel. Gasps rippled through the mourners, and some began to whisper prayers in shock. The officers acted quickly, halting the burial at once. Confusion spread like wildfire. How could such a mistake have happened? Margaret collapsed to her knees, clutching the photograph of Daniel to her chest, her tears now mingling with disbelief. For years she had feared losing him, and in that moment, the cruel truth twisted into something she could not comprehend. Could her son still be alive? A hasty investigation unraveled the chaos of that bloody night. 2 officers had been rushed to the hospital, both critically wounded, their faces unrecognizable beneath layers of blood and bandages. One had died from massive blood loss. The other had been placed in an induced coma after emergency surgery. In the rush and panic, the doctors had mistaken their identities, declaring Daniel Hayes dead when in fact it was another brave comrade who had succumbed. The weight of the revelation struck everyone, but none more than Margaret. Relief clashed with guilt, hope with grief. She thought of the other mother who had truly lost her child that night, and her heart ached with both gratitude and sorrow. Through her blurred vision, Margaret turned to Max. The German shepherd stood still now, no longer barking, his amber eyes fixed on the coffin as though he had known the truth all along. The officers could only bow their heads in shame and apology. But within that moment of despair, one thing became undeniable. Max, through loyalty and instinct, had saved his partner from being buried under a stone that did not belong to him. The hospital ward smelled faintly of antiseptic, its walls pale and unwelcoming. For weeks, Margaret had walked those sterile corridors, her heart caught between fragile hope and crushing fear. Each time she entered Daniel's room, she saw the same still figure. Her son, lying motionless, his chest rising only with the aid of machines. She prayed by his bedside every night, rosary clutched in her trembling hands, whispering words to God she had not spoken with such desperation since her husband's death. And then, one morning, the miracle came. A soft sound, a breath, a murmur, pulled her from half-sleep. Daniel's eyelids fluttered, his hazel eyes blinking against the light. Confusion clouded his gaze until it finally focused on her. "Mom?" The word was broken, fragile. But to Margaret it was a hymn, the sweetest sound her ears had ever known. She collapsed over him, sobbing, her voice shaking. "God has given you back to me." The nurses rushed in, but stepped back when they saw the mother's embrace, as if acknowledging that this was a sacred moment beyond medicine. When Daniel was strong enough to be discharged, Margaret stood waiting at the hospital steps, her heart pounding like that of a girl half her age. As the wheelchair carried him forward, she threw her arms around him, pressing her cheek to his chest as though to assure herself he was truly alive. Behind them, Max's tail wagged furiously, his amber eyes glistening with joy. He pressed his head against Daniel's arm, and for the first time since the ordeal began, the family felt whole again. But Margaret's heart, though overflowing with relief, did not forget the price of survival. Another family had buried their son in Daniel's place, and Margaret could not allow that sacrifice to fade into silence. From that day forward, she chose to care for the grave of Daniel's fallen comrade. Every Sunday, she laid flowers there, whispering prayers not only for the man who died, but for the mother who had truly lost. And so life moved forward. In a small home touched by both grief and grace, an elderly mother, her reborn son, and a faithful dog wove together their days. Love, loyalty, and gratitude bound them, stronger than tragedy, brighter than death itself. In the quiet corners of our daily lives, miracles rarely come with thunder or fire. They often arrive in whispers. A mother's prayer, a loyal dog's bark, or the courage of a soul who refuses to surrender. The story of Margaret, Daniel, and Max reminds us that God's grace can shine even through heartbreak, turning despair into hope and loss into love. May this tale inspire you to look for those quiet miracles in your own life and to treasure the bonds that hold us together. If this story touched your heart, share it, leave a comment, and subscribe so that together we can spread kindness and faith to the world. May God bless every viewer who carries this message forward.